Welcome to Minds Between Languages. Joining us today is Fabio Alves, who will discuss how to study pragmatic aspects of translation from a cognitive perspective. Welcome, Fabio. It's fantastic to have you here on Minds Between Languages. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Hi, Adolfo. It's really nice to be here with you. So, looking forward to this interview.
Fantastic. Let's get right into it. And you work on so many different areas within cognitive translation studies, but I guess it would be fair to say that one of your main areas of study has to do with pragmatics in translation. And that's what I would like to discuss today mainly with you. I guess a fair initial question is, what exactly is pragmatics?
Well, that's a very good question and not an easy one to answer. I think there is no clear-cut definition about what pragmatics is, but in a very broad sense, I would say that pragmatics is the study of language use. We may have some definitions like it's the study of the relation of signs to those who use the signs. So this is Jacob May, for instance. You may have many different pragmatic theories and frameworks, but we don't have, let's say, a generally accepted paradigm. What I think we should bear in mind is that there are two, let's say, broad traditions. An Anglo-American tradition, which is more like cognitive philosophical oriented, and a continental European tradition, which is more like socio-cultural interactive oriented. So I think this gives us a scenario. And if I bring it closer to my own work, I'm definitely affiliated to the Anglo-American tradition, so which is cognitively oriented. We could say, for instance, in the words of Sperber and Wilson, the authors or the founders of relevant theory, that pragmatics as a theory of utterance interpretation is a branch of cognitive psychology. So this would be taking the definition in a very straight direction into like looking at cognitive processes. And so I tend to accept this as my definition of pragmatics. I'm interested in the study of language use from a cognitive perspective and approaching cognitive psychology or the tools of cognitive psychology to do that. So I hope this answers your question.
It really does, and it's quite refreshing to have this pragmatic perspective and this focus on language use and the interplay between what is being said, what's being implied, and how those two things may be co-determined by who's saying what to whom, the context, previous knowledge, and things like that. Now, I wonder, Fabio, what is the role of pragmatics in translation in particular, and perhaps even more focally, what does a pragmatic perspective bring to cognitive translation studies?
Okay, so this again is not a clear-cut answer. I think I can provide you and our audience with my own interpretation of such
Please
questions. And so if we look at pragmatics and translation, there has always been an association in terms of trying to make sense of the translated text for the purposes of the audience. If we go back to the 1980s and the Scopus theory, that's what Hans Vermeer and Katharina Heiss were interested in. So we had the scopus, the aim of the translation, as being of paramount importance. If we look at the words of the work of Christian North, for instance, with the sender pragmatics and the receiver pragmatics, so it had always been a point of concern, but I think we only moved into a more cognitive oriented approach to pragmatics in translation studies when Ernst August Gut published his work in 1991, looking at translation relevance and cognition. And Gut, way back then, defined translation as a case of interpretive language use, a definition that I embrace myself. And I think defining translation as a case of interpretive use of language allows us to operationalize what Good calls interpretive resemblance. We are not talking about source text and target text and aligning one to the other. We are trying to create an interpretive resemblance in the target text. And so this can only be achieved if you have a cognitive framework in the background. So this is when relevant theory comes in very handy. So if we think of cognitive pragmatics, as I mentioned earlier, trying to narrow down the definition of pragmatics, if it's cognitive pragmatics that we're interested in, then relevant theory is the only cognitive pragmatic approach within translation studies. There is no shadow of doubt with respect to that. And then I think I can approach the last part of your question. So how does it relate to cognitive translation studies? Well, as it says, cognitive translation studies is interested in exploring the cognitive operations that underline the act of translation or translation task execution, if you will. To that extent, relevant theory and concepts like interpretive use of language or interpretive resemblance may help us shed light into the intricacies of translation task execution. So that should be it, I think.
If as you said, the real turning point for a truly cognitive pragmatic approach within cognitive and translation studies hinged on relevance theory and on those foundational works by Good uh, at the turn of the century, right? I guess it would be fair to say that that particular approach did not occupy a very central position in the field's agenda up to that point. And I wonder, Fabio, whether that has changed in the last 20 or 25 years. Would you say that this cognitive pragmatic perspective on translation has now become more mainstream in our field?
Well, Adolfo, it has definitely become more mainstream, but I think, if we are just fair to the development of this interest, if you will, so we should go back a little bit further. I think works like those carried out by Danica Seleskovich and Marianne Lederer at the Sorbonne in Paris in the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, but I mean, we can trace it back to the late 60s with very interesting but quite problematic concepts like deverbalization, for instance, that you would have an instance of input, an instance of deverbalizing and letting meaning arise out of deverbalization, and then re-expressing it in a different way. So I had a very interesting conversation with Marianne Lederer once in Istanbul. We both attended the same conference, and I gave a talk drawing on relevance theory to elucidate instances of translation process research. And then she said something that I never forgot. She said, it's very interesting what you say, and we've been saying it throughout. The only thing is we didn't have the tools that you have to explain what we somehow knew from intuition. So I'm referring to that because I think this is a very important element in our discussion. We've been building up things. So what we do now, and I definitely think that it's becoming more and more mainstream, but we have to acknowledge those who have come before us. So if we acknowledge the theory of sense, Seleskovich and Lederer, we would also have to acknowledge the German functionalists, Hans Vermeer, Katharina Reis, Christian Nord. So not for having a cognitive approach to that, but for pointing out that there was a way that we should explore. And then with the advent of translation process research, we started building the tools that would allow us to do that. So it's a gradual process. And if we look back in time, so we only had think aloud protocols when we started. So I think, so we can talk about that as the interview unfolds, but I think it has become mainstream or more mainstream because of paving the way towards what we have now. So I hope I won't disappoint you or our audience if I say the answer to your question is yes and no. Yes, it's definitely become more mainstream. No. So we owe a lot to what has been done before we were there. So yeah, so middle way, I think.
Far from being disappointed, Jorge Luis Borges once said something to the extent that ambiguity in itself is always a form of richness. So I would be the least person to say that a yes and no type of answer is disappointing. Far from it. And you did give me the perfect transition into the next questions that I wanted to ask you, Fabio, which actually have to do with the tools proper, and more particularly with the ways in which you and your team have been able to leverage different techniques to study pragmatics. And you've used different tools in your study of pragmatics in translation. One of the tools that you've used is keylogging. In at least one study, you've tracked keystroke activity patterns in order to infer aspects of pragmatic processes during translation. Could you tell us a little bit about that particular approach and how one can go from tracking finger movements on a keyboard to inferring pragmatic aspects of translation?
Well, again, easy to ask, difficult to answer. So you're asking very challenging questions, but thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to elaborate a little bit on that. So, Adolfo, in my own trajectory as a researcher, I've always tried to build up rather than give up and start again. This is one of my traits, my characteristics as a researcher. So I belong to a somewhat older generation, not the first generation, but to perhaps the second generation of translation process researchers. I was trained in Germany by Frank Königs, who was a contemporary of Hans-Peter Krings at Universität Bochum, where they both worked in the 1980s. And then I joined the university as a PhD student in 1991, and I was there for 4.5 years. So somehow I was trained in the tradition of think aloud protocols, and this is what I used for my own PhD research. And then when we moved on and started using keystroke logging, after I met Angelique Jacobsen and the trap team from the Copenhagen Business School, and we started using translog to map keystroke logging. I didn't give up TAPS, think aloud protocols. It was only then in 2003 when Artlik Jacobson gave us robust evidence that think aloud, concurrent think aloud, might create or generate cognitive overload, is that we moved into retrospection. And I'm making that point to clarify why retrospection or retrospective verbal protocols have always been very important to the work I do and still are. Because it's not only mapping keystroke logging, because the retrospective verbal protocols will let us know at what level so those subjects were performing. So you might say we operationalize the concept of micro and macro translation units to map the unfolding of segmentation in translation task execution. But it's when we look at retrospective verbal protocols that we can try to match what were the meta representations of the translator and his actual actions. And here we come to very interesting things. So sometimes segmentation is very short, but elaboration is at a much higher level. So when you look at the performance of novice translators or student translators, they work in very short segments, but because they were trained to elaborate at larger segments, they operationalize or they work practically word by word, but they talk about what they did in chunks. So this gives us an idea of what type of meta representation they were operating on. And I think this is one of the crucial features that we have to compare novice and professional translators. To what extent what you do in terms of segmentation, in terms of key logging, in terms of pauses, in terms of deletions, in terms of new edits, match what you report retrospectively when you talk about what you did. So I think this is one of the most important elements that we use in terms of looking at translation as a cognitive activity from a pragmatic oriented perspective. We have to try and make sense of the real online actions and the meta representations that account for those actions. So we expect that the more professional, the more expert a translator is, the higher the balance between the meta representation and the actual performance. Without extending much, but I'll just give you a very interesting example.
Please.
Which we only had very rudimentary techniques at the time, but we see someone working at a very fast pace, a real expert translator, and he is just working nonstop, or what Artlik Jacobson usually names or calls instances of peak performance. And he stops. He stops, and you don't see anything. And then he continues, and he continues, and he continues. And then he goes back and he pastes something into his text. And you don't really understand at the moment when you do that. But then you realize that he only did that because he had found an anaphoric reference for something that could only be there if something had been said before. And he realizes, oh, I missed a line or two of text. I read and skipped. So without stopping, he continues and finishes the sentence he was working on. He goes up. We didn't have eye tracking at the time, so we couldn't see his looking up, but we see the copy and paste or see the pasting. And then we make sense, wow. And then when we go back to, or when we go to the retrospective interview, to the retrospective protocol, this is what this translator tells us.
Right.
So I stopped because I realized that I had skipped a line or two. But I prefer to continue and finish what I was doing and then go back, translate it and paste where it belonged. So I think this gives you a very interesting example of how key logging in combination with retrospective verbal protocols can elucidate instances of translation task execution.
It certainly does, and I guess what's also interesting is the juxtaposition about this method and the combination of keystroke logging here and the retrospective verbal protocols. So you have basically an account of real-time translation as it unfolds, and then someone, the performer of that translation, telling you what was going on. But you've also used other techniques, and perhaps the most recent one you've incorporated into your toolkit was functional resonance imaging. And I had the good fortune of becoming familiar with one study that you and your team led in Brazil at the Letra Lab, and that's an entirely different setting, because when you're taking a look at brain activity in relation to certain constructions, you're not really seeing translation as it unfolds in a more naturalistic setting. It's an entirely different way of approaching the issue. Could you please tell us a little bit about that particular study, what it was that you and your team studied, and what are the benefits and the limitations of exploring pragmatic aspects of translation in a more confined setting, such as the one that a neuroscientific study typically provides?
Yeah, again, you're asking very challenging questions.
I never said it was going to be easy, Fabio, so you can't hold me accountable for that.
But, well, I'll try to make it as simple as I can.
Please.
Because this is not a very easy answer that I can provide you with. But let's just go back to what I was saying, building up on tools and methodologies, going from concurrent think aloud to key logging and retrospective think aloud, and then moving into eye tracking. So the example I gave earlier, so we didn't have eye tracking, so we couldn't really see the translator's gaze move up and identify that he had skipped a line, but that's what he did. So eye tracking allowed us to incorporate that dimension into our design. And we could then see, okay, so now we can look at eye key span, where the eye is and where the fingers are. But to a certain extent, we had only been using secondary data. We had been using behavioral data. And we all know that translation takes place in the brain. I mean, it takes place in the body because we need our fingers, we need our eyes, but we have a very complex mental operations going on. And we became very interested in trying to make sense of that complexity at a neurophysiological level. But we couldn't really start anew and just give up what we did before, what we had done before, and start again. So we started thinking about what we could do. And considering that I'd been using relevant theory throughout, and the concept of meta representation had always been of paramount importance for any work I have done or my team has done, we said, oh, we have to find a way to explore that. This is when we came across studies using fMRI, drawing on theory of mind. And theory of mind explores or operationalizes the concept of perspective taking, which can be mapped on the brain. So we created an analogy, a theoretical analogy between the concept of meta representation and the concept of perspective taking, placing both in a level that we could say what theory of mind accounts for as perspective taking. We will assume that theoretically, from a relevant theoretic perspective, it's an instance of meta representation.
So let me see if I'm following this idea. So theory of mind, it's actually this concept from cognitive psychology was actually
Yeah,
first developed in the context of primate studies, right? And
exactly.
the idea is that we let's speak about humans now. We have the capacity to infer what other people are thinking or feeling or going through,
Absolutely.
even when
Absolutely.
even when they are not overtly telling us or giving us any direct ostensible sign of it. And perspective taking. So the idea is that perhaps that the translator needs to have needs to be able to sort of zoom into the mind of the person who produced the source text. Is there something like that at the basis of what you're saying, Fabio?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. Let me try and give you another example which may help us clarify that. Relevant theory differentiates between descriptive language use and interpret language use. So I said earlier, translation can be seen as a case of interpretive language use. If I say, this is a chair, I'm describing a state of affairs. But if I say, I think this is a chair, so this becomes an interpretation, right? So it's on the basis of that that we construe the concept of meta representation. It's not a chair. I think it's a chair. So this is what translators do, isn't it? So we think someone else said something or wrote something. So this is the basis of, so construing interpretive resemblance. So the idea that you're taking perspective is an idea that what you are referring to has an opinion involved. So it's your understanding. It's just like I say, what do you think of my haircut? And if you answer me, it's very difficult to find a good hairstylist. So, depending on your intonation, you may be appreciating my haircut, or you may just pointing out that I should have looked for a better hairstylist, right?
Just,
But this
just,
is
just,
perspective
just
taking.
to clarify, I would be the last person to make any comments on anybody's haircut, just because of the retaliations. But please go ahead, Fabio.
Well, that's a point, and it's an act of interpretation, isn't it, Adolfo?
It is.
We think that by equating matter representation and perspective taking, we could use the tools provided by theory of mind and applied to the use of fMRI, functional resonance, magnetic resonance, um, to compare to what we had done before. So our study has two aspects. Using the same input, the same design, we carried out a behavioral study with eye tracking, and we carried out a neurophysiological study with fMRI. But the input were exactly the same, and the cycles we carried out, so the experimentation, were exactly the same. And we used E prime to control for reaction times, both in the behavioral environment with eye tracking and in the neurophysiological environment with fMRI. And what we were trying to see is just what we see behaviorally, is it going to be somewhat similar or illustrate or elucidate what we see when we do a neurophysiological study? And the design we had would point out that perspective taking and meta representation, if found at a kind of similar levels, so we were looking at meta representation using eye tracking, and we were looking at regions in the brain which are responsible or are activated when perspective taking is operated, is activated. So this would be our aim. And the results, we haven't finished the experiments, so we've only had a first cohort with novice translators. We now have data from professional translators, which we are still analyzing. So the publication, the study you mentioned, so we used only novice translators. And for those novice translators, perspective taking or meta representation in translation is still in the process of being developed. So they are still being trained. But we could see some evidence that differentiates reading activity from translational activity, both in terms of behavior when we look at eye tracking and in terms of brain activation when we look at translational activity. So the areas which lit up in the brain, if you will, for reading and translation tasks were somewhat different. So perhaps not as activated as we would have wished for, but we can understand and account for that because those subjects were still developing their translation skills. What we hope to show when we have data from professional translators is that activation, brain activation of those regions is also an acquired skill. You learn to become a translator as you develop your perspective taking skills. So if we show that, we will also have robust brain evidence that meta representation works for translation and is also developed in a sense of as an acquired skill. So I think I was a little bit perhaps technical in some respects, but I hope I have provided at least some reasonable explanation.
That's fantastic, actually. And if anything, I can't wait to read about those new results. And this idea that that you build, that you're always building on previous things rather than reinventing things anew. I'd like to take a broader perspective now as we reach the final part of the interview, Fabio. And in 2003, you published a very well-known book called Triangulating Translation, which pretty much captured the zeitgeist of translation process research at the turn of the century. And now, last year, you published the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Cognition, which is probably the most comprehensive volume, again, capturing the zeitgeist of the field, but now in, let's say, 20 years into the 21st century. With the benefit of this, let's say, wide-ranging panoramic view that you have of the field and its development, what do you think have been the most exciting breakthroughs in the last years in cognitive translation and interpreting studies?
Well, I think if we are rounding up this interview, so you couldn't have asked a better question. Because if we look at Triangulating Translation, published in 2003, and if we look at the Routledge Handbook of Translation Cognition, published last year, so we have nearly 20 years of research in between. Triangulating Translation was an edited volume, and so is the Handbook of Translation and Cognition. So we owe a lot to contributors, to colleagues, to researchers. This is not something that we've done on our own. This is not a solo flight. So it's the result of, so working together with very interesting, motivated people around the world. And I've been very fortunate to be in close contact with lots of those people, including yourself. And so that's how we develop things. So from a moment or a point in time where we had very limited resources, so we only had retrospective or verbal protocols and key logging way back in 2003, and we have, artificial intelligence, human-computer interaction, contemporary cognitive science, and we have a lot of knowledge produced over the years by all those people. So what I can say is that if we look back in time, we can identify different phases in the study of translation as a cognitive activity. If we go back to Danica Selaskovic and Marianne Lederer, so we will say we have intuition or note-taking. And then we start having verbal protocols and key logging and eye tracking and now fMRI. but we've also been working very hard on developing the basis of our own subdiscipline in the making. So I think, as a reference, I think it's very important to mention an article by Sharon O'Brien called The Borrowers, which has been very inspirational to many of us. Let's say we've been borrowing a lot, but we also in a position to lend to other disciplines what we now know about translation and cognition. And I think this is what the handbook of translation and cognition aims at. So, triangulating translation 20 years ago or 17 years ago um, aimed at providing some robust methodology or some foundations or stepping stones for translation process research. Well, with the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Cognition, I think we are aiming much higher. We want to overcome the borrower's paradigm and change that by consolidating a subdiscipline. I think cognitive translation studies has definitely come of age, and we are now in a position to establish a very fruitful dialogue with the disciplines, the neighboring disciplines that are relevant to us and to which we are also relevant. So I think this sums up, so what you asked about, where are we now and what has happened in between.
It really does. And allow me to thank you publicly, both you and Arndt Jacobsen, the two co-editors of that volume, for undertaking such a massive initiative spanning dozens and dozens of chapters, cutting across so many different topics and fields or subfields. And it's the type of tour de force that really allow people now and even generations to come to have a sense of what the field is and what the field was like at a certain point in time. It's sort of a placeholder, and it has such a massive encyclopedic and at the same time historical value. And it was a privilege to be a part of it. So thank you very much for that effort, Fabio, and thank you very much for devoting some time to sharing your knowledge, your experience, your ideas, your anecdotes with us. It's been a pleasure to have you here on Minds Between Languages, and we can't wait to learn more about your fascinating work.
Well, thank you very much, Adolfo. It's been a pleasure. So, as I said, so everything that we do is the result of collective effort. So, very much like what you are doing with this interview series. So we are part of a network. And as part of a network is that we can grow together and actually offer some very interesting, insightful thoughts and results to the community at large. So I thank you very much for the opportunity. And well, I hope we'll have a chance to meet face to face in a not so distant future so that when mobility becomes possible on this planet of ours. So I say goodbye for now. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, Fabio. Thank you very much, and that will happen very soon, definitely. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye then.